Right in there, like. Jason, how are you? Right on. Hold my LaCroix. Okay, maybe started, yeah, Karen, can I get a roll call?
All right, Brian Boos.
Here.
Joseph Lewis.
Here.
Terry Wallach.
Here.
Jason Wertz. Chairman Patel.
Here. Okay, to move, get the agenda moving, can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. And I get a motion to approve the minutes of the November 1st meeting.
So
Such a
moved.
long time ago.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right, in consideration of petitions, I guess tonight we've got 22-1101. Can I get a, well, actually, can we get engineering to open this up for us?
Second.
All in favor? Okay.
All right, so tonight is the much anticipated zoning ordinance update. So we've been working on this project since 2019. Michael Blue from Tesca and David Silverman from Ansel Glink are here tonight to do the overall presentation. We have had a sort of summary of the major changes posted on the website, as well as the full text of the ordinance for both the planning commissioners and the public to review. We've had numerous sort of outreach. So we had a public open house right before COVID, put us on pause for a while. They conducted a lot of phone call and in-person interviews with residents and business owners and property owners. And they've been meeting with staff on a very regular basis to go over everything, as well as sort of those steering work group, which included then trustee Pileski, trustee Domke, and Jason. Terry served on it. Lydia's from ZBA has been on it. as well as Jason Belaski, the village administrator, and myself. So we feel like we have pretty good update for you guys to sort of review and hash out. Michael and David are sort of going to go by section, and we're going to go over the major changes that we're proposing. And then I think how we did it last time in the work group was just ask questions with each section instead of trying to power through. So I think that's how we'll do it. Yeah.
Start with a security alert.
Sure.
Yes, let's query then. Can I get your name and address, please, first of all?
My name is Michael Blue. I'm with Tesca Associates. Our company is at 627 Grove in Evanston.
Okay, can you raise your right hand? It's a process.
No, you can do it. David can be sworn at the same time.
Okay,
Yeah, David Silverman, partner at Ansel Glink in Chicago, 140 South Dearborn Street.
okay. Need you guys to raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Okay, thank you.
So what we want to do as part of this public hearing to kind of roll out the ordinance, which as Karen mentioned, has been out and about and available for review. But we'd like to present to you a summary. We're not going to go page by page. We're not going to turn through. To the extent that you have questions as we go through each chapter, David and we're going to ask Karen to help us answer the hard questions, by the way, that the three of us will be able to share with you what's been changed and how and why a little bit. And so we'll do a little bit of background for those of you that have not been integral to the process, for the folks that are here, and for anybody else who's watching, give you a little bit of background. As Karen said, we'll stop at the end of each section and see what questions and comments there are. And that's just what we'll do. We'll kind of go through. Any questions before we get started? Okay, let's roll. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit about what the update process was. And then we will go through each section and talk about changes. And then we can answer comments and questions generally. So in terms of the update process, let's go to the next slide. As Karen mentioned, we did start this pre-COVID, took a bit of a bump, but we had a great workshop here in this room where we talked about a couple of things. We talked mostly just about Roselle. The idea of the zoning ordinance, the whole purpose of the zoning ordinance is to codify the community that you all live in and enjoy and want to preserve and help be what it is. And so we talked about these ideas about, what is town center? What is the village? And we talked about words like safety and friendly and that sort of thing. So this is a technical document. This is a legal document. This is why, as planners, we're excited to work with David and his team at Ansel Glink, because you get a very sound legal document, but it's also part of an implementation of the comprehensive plan, which was a policy document. So there is an art and a science going on here. That was very much where we started. The next slide. Beyond that, then the work gets a little bit more technical, right? We do our own sort of internal review. We sit and read the code. And based on the fact that David is both a planner and an attorney, works for any number of communities as their corporation counsel, spends a lot of time with zoning ordinances. I spent 15 years of my career as a zoning administrator working for municipalities. Between us, we work together to rewrite zoning ordinances. So I'm going to doubt that you or anybody behind me reads zoning for fun. Although if you're ever up late, can't sleep, I might recommend it. We read a lot of zoning. More to the point, we spend a lot of time, and our firm spend a lot of time helping people sort through the questions that come up in your zoning ordinance. Well, what did this mean? And when they wrote this, what did this mean? So we have a very practical approach to zoning. And we reviewed the code with just that approach. And so that was really the foundation of the update work that we did. We also, as Karen said, we talked to a lot of stakeholders, folks who are customers of the ordinance. Property owners, business owners, engineers, designers, the folks who would have this experience of going through. Once we're done with that, we start drafting, and we draft a section at a time, share it with staff. When we started, Pat was here. We had a great meeting with Pat and Karen where we talked about how we were going to put all this together and what things were important. But essentially, it's an iterative process. We draft, we share with staff. We sit down and talk about it together. We refine it. Then after it was all compiled, that's when it went to the steering committee. And that's really when you get into phase 4. And that's kind of where we are now, which is to share the completed process with you and the community and move on to adoption. If we go to the next slide, we already did. Why do this, right? Why spend these years quite literally doing this and what was needed? And I would tell you from our technical notes, from our technical review of it, there was a lot of good reasons to redo the code. Codes just get old, right? They've got old land uses in them. I rewrote one that had abattoir in it once, which slaughterhouse, if you don't know, but it's not really a common land use anymore. So codes just get old. As they get updated, they get hard to read. There are internal conflicts that end up in them. If you're ever turning through the zoning ordinance, you get to the end of the section, there's those all those notes down at the bottom that tell you when the section was amended. And some of them will get really, really long, right? That's kind of a clue that the code is getting old. As codes age, they fall out of place with state and federal legislation and statute. And so that needs to be cleaned up. The definition section is really very important, probably more for staff, you folks, than most people, but it's got to be clear. If you're going to administer a code, you have to have clear definitions. You have to have a definition section that includes some graphics where that helps explain what it is. So, so that was an issue that we came up with. The comprehensive plan had recently been completed, and there were a lot of ideas in there about design guidelines, which we first kicked off at the open house that we had those pictures of and have been refining ever since. The nonconformity section was just confusing. It needed to be clarified. And that's what I will tell you was a lot of the update to the code was to clarifying things. So if we go to the next slide, a few more of these things. Like I said, modernizing zoning districts, which are really kind of the heart of it, right? It's what's allowed in everybody's neighborhood or what's allowed in every business district. And we reorganized it a little bit to make it easier to use as much as anything else. A couple important things to keep in mind. We did not change bulk standards, except for a couple of particular things in the town center, which we'll mention. We didn't change bulk standards. How close somebody's building can be to the property line, how tall somebody's property can be, that stays the same. The reason we do that is because if you change that, you potentially create a lot of nonconformities and a lot of challenges for property owners. So there was no specific reason, except for the one like I mentioned, we'll talk about it, to change that. So we've not changed the rules for how tall or far setback anybody's house can be. We have not rezoned any property. We've not changed the zoning map. So if somebody's property was zoned R1, it still will be. That's just not going to change. Again, same sort of thing. If you have to, you do it. If you don't have to, it can cause a lot of confusion and a lot of challenge for people. So we only do it where it's absolutely necessary. I can tell you that we did remove the B1 district because none of it was mapped anywhere in town, and the same with the ag. We updated the parking regulations. They were not modern by any stretch of the imagination. We updated the notice provision. Notice provisions in most zoning ordinances are far more complicated than they need to be, and they're complicated in a way that it doesn't really add any value to the process. There is still notice. There will be notice. Neighbors will know what's going on, but as we'll explain, it'll be a lot clearer. And the same with the sign code. The sign code is something that we will bring to you at a future meeting, but it too was showing its age, and we've been working on updating that. David, any observations you wanted to point to that I missed or that you want to add?
Yeah, I think like a very important part of this particular process with Roselle was modernizing things. The code had been amended over time, so there was inconsistencies built in, like Michael explained. Also clarifying language. One of the things that we look for is a readable, navigable code for people on both sides of the table. And you know, the village's code over just a long period of time became a very dense document. The other thing that happened was staff over a period of years had developed their own systems to process applications. Those work really well. The feedback we were getting from the focus groups was very positive about how staff uses the code and employs the code. So we wanted to memorialize that in the changes that we will be presenting tonight. And then otherwise, as Michael said, the new sign code, we're doing sign codes very differently now than what we used to because of some Supreme Court decisions. It's going to be very graphics heavy. It's going to move away from anything having to do with having to interpret messages to determine what kind of sign it is. It's all going to be what we call time, place, and manner regulations, but it's going to be a very graphic driven code section, and that's what's taking a little bit of time.
So we'd like to go through each section and we'll highlight, this is pretty much in the memo that you had that was part of the agenda that people could see. We'll run through some of those key points, and if you have any questions either about those general ideas or about something specific that you saw in the code or have a question, we'll invite those questions from you as we go through. Okay, next slide. The title, purpose, and definition is the necessary, but not something that most people deal with. But this section was changed to reflect modern uses and names that were not included in the code. We added definition. We added graphics throughout, particularly with the definitions. One of the things that is important is as you're interpreting the code, Aaron in particular, you all as commissioners, the property owners, as you're interpreting the code, it's important that if you decide you want X kind of business, that you can go to the code and see a definition for what that business is to know if you're allowed in B2, B3, am I a B5? I don't know, right? And so the land use table, which is also new, is now tied to those definitions so that that's just easier to use. We hope when all is said and done, and we know that there will hopefully be less phone calls to the planning staff in terms of there being something confusing. And definitions, again, like I said before, is a big part of that. We also added something that we thought would be useful to make the document user-friendly. As you'll notice that every one of the sections starts with a how to use this section. Because zoning, as much as we like it, we know is not everybody's jam, right? And so the idea of including something in incredibly plain English that says why and how you use this is in the code. And we know that some communities will kind of take these sections out, put them on the website, incorporate them in other documents, just so that they can make the zoning ordinance more accessible to others. So anyway, title and purpose is really just the introductory legal framework. Definitions is really the teeth of this section. So were there any, well, hold on one second before we jump ahead. I just want to know if there are any comments or questions about that section from the commission. Okay, moving on. So general provisions is exactly what it says. I joke sometimes that it's the junk drawer of the zoning ordinance because everything that is broadly applicable and happens on most properties in town can be found here. In the current code, it's found in a few places, and part of the job here was to put it primarily into one section. So again, and this will be a theme that you see as we go through and that David mentioned initially, is that a lot of this was about cleaning up language, cleaning up oddly worded language. We regulated a certain number of the regulations. So things like outdoor seating, trash enclosures, lighting, home occupation, yard encroachments. These were simplified. These had a lot of process attached to them, or these had a lot of long explanations of what was necessary. What we did with these is we had them focus on impact, right? So that rather than the ordinance trying to presuppose everything that could happen, which it ultimately can't, that the standards are based on what is the potential impact, whether or not it's traffic or cars parked or that sort of thing, and sets that as a standard. And then to the extent there's a problem with that, well, then the village has got a sound enforcement tool. There's the word modernization again. We've added telecommunication, wind, and solar, so that if people want to do solar panels, that sort of thing, they can do that. One of the things that was in there that was kind of unusual was the standard that allowed for a garage to essentially be the size of a house. And that's generous by any definition. It's also can be unwieldy and impactful to neighbors. So in talking with the steering committee, we talked about setting that at 800 square feet for both attached and detached garages. So there's equity between those two situations. And an 800 square foot garage is generous. If you imagine that a lot of garages are 22 or 25 by about 20 or 25, that gets you to 625 at best. So it's not a 3-car garage, but it's a generous 2.5-car garage.
I have a question. So in the process of doing this, how specific did you get? So for example, I understand the 800 square foot setback and all that. That's ingrained, right? But if you had talked about lighting, for example, are you going in and basically saying the lighting should not be a distraction, or is it you shouldn't exceed a certain amount of lumens or whatever? How specific does this get?
Great question. It's actually less specific than the current one is. The current one requires a lighting plan that shows a lot of different standards in there. And what we did, and I don't remember if it's in here or if it's in the performance section. What it does is it talks about the simplified standards that work. So a couple of things. One is it talks about high to low ratio, right? So you don't have hot spots in a parking lot. So a badly designed parking lot, it's really bright underneath the light, but there's dark spots between. And so there's that averaging ratio that's part of the photometric standard. That's the one we kept. We also required have a limit, which I think is 1 foot candle. See, now you're gonna ask about the details and I'm not gonna have them at my fingertips, but so I think it's 1 foot candle at a property line, which is pretty standard and pretty low. And the other thing that we did was we started to talk about glare, which is really a lot of the issue that comes up with lighting. And the simplest and most effective way to do that is to require that the light source not be visible. Right. And so the best example is, and now you'll never be able to go to a gas station again and not notice this. I'm sorry. But if you go to a gas station, you're under the canopy, you're pumping gas, you'll see 2 kinds of light fixtures that may happen. One is where the light fixture extends below the canopy. The other is where it's recessed into the canopy. And what you'll see as you come into this to the gas station is where the light fixture is visible, there's a lot of glare. Where it's recessed and is shining down, there's less glare. So with really those 3 specific things, you can accomplish an awful lot. And that's what we went for. As much bang for the buck as we can without making it overly complex, which is hard for people that are using it. It's frankly hard for staff. And you all have to try and make sense of it as well.
I mean, another important point about all this is enforceability of the provisions.
Right.
So keeping the most commonsensical provisions in the code enhances the village's enforcement authority.
They also differentiated whether the property is residential or non-residential, so how much the candle would be at the.
Yeah. I was just pointing to lighting as an example. I just wanted to see what your thought process was during the entire, update.
It's a great example. I appreciate you asking. The next one that's in here is privacy fences. Not about a side yard, but a side yard. I apologize for that. But again, we talk about zoning being for large, massive buildings everywhere, but a lot of it comes down to things that affect people's day-to-day lives. And a lot of times that's fences. And one of the issues that had been here that we talked a lot with staff about was how do you deal with corner side yards for fences? Right. And I know that there were a lot of variations that you heard for these. Hearing a lot of variations is also an indication that it's time to take a look at a zoning standard. And something that we talked with staff about and that we thought would work well, that the steering committee supported too, was this idea, as you see in the graphic here, that you can have a fence in a corner side yard. You can have a privacy fence in a corner side yard, basically halfway between the of whatever the setback is. So it allows people to have a little bit more yard. One of the problems with these corner side yard things, when people put up a fence for a little privacy or to keep a dog or a kid in, is you lose a tremendous amount of yard. But having it on the property line is really kind of intrusive to people that are walking on the sidewalk and potentially dangerous for people who are driving. And so this was something that was a compromise. That again kind of gets to your question of how do the details explain the overall approach that we had. David, anything else about general provisions? Any questions or comments about general provisions?
Is there anything that you did that can basically be a backlash? Will people all of a sudden come back and say, well, this is the old way, now you've got a better new way, can I go back and retroactively change? Is that something that we should worry about?
I wouldn't worry about it. Is it possible? Boy, and that's a great question. So is there something that we made stricter, right? That, there may well be, but probably not. Like I said, when it came to yard setbacks, which is the biggest thing, we kept that the same. The other one is, there's a table in there and we've clarified it and revised it a little bit. There's a table in this section that talks about yard encroachments. Where can I put my shed? Where can I put my pergola? Where can I, right? I don't recall that we made any dramatic changes to that either, if any. We clarified what things were, but so, if you could put your shed in a certain spot, you can still do that. So we tried not to change that. You'll notice I didn't promise anything in that entire little spiel, but I don't,
Okay.
nothing comes to mind. And if we had, we would have raised it for you in the memo and it would have come up here.
I was on steering committee with this. I don't remember any. I was on the steering committee with this and I don't remember any major shifts in the actual ordinances and zoning components,
Right.
but it was more or less streamlining a lot of the processes and rearranging where things were so they could be more easily identified. And I think less so much for this commission as it would be for the zoning appeals board, where there's a lot of things that for 10, 20 years have been a norm and they're getting a variance on it every time somebody comes in.
Yeah.
Why are they coming in?
Okay.
And that was kind of what I felt was the mass majority of changes or differences was similar things to that. Not any real change in how Roselle functions in its
Thank you.
zoning or anywhere particular.
Cool.
And
Thanks.
to build on that point a little bit, I don't want you to sit there and think, boy, you just moved stuff around for 3 years. What did you guys do? What we did not do is we did not take a model. We did not take somebody else's chapter and just put it in here. We rewrote every sentence in the code. And that's a long, painful, tedious thing that you think it's hard to read. But that's part of
And I made them rewrite it.
But again, it speaks to the point of the approach, which is by just rewriting and clarifying so it's easier to use. We didn't take a standard from somewhere else and apply it here. That's how we also feel comfortable that we haven't put any of those little landmines in there that you were talking about.
Fair enough.
Okay, no other questions. Let's keep going. Zoning districts is where probably most of the reorganization occurred. But again, like I said, we did not rezone anybody's property. We did not change anybody's setbacks. We clarified some things. We added a land use table. So what you had before was you'd go to the B3 section and you'd read through to find the type of business that you had, for instance. And this is all now in a table, which allows you to compare and contrast. So as a business owner, you can get a sense of which zoning districts you can look to have your business in. From a staff standpoint, it's always very helpful to be able to evaluate a zoning request change or any kind of zoning request just based on what's in there. So the table is really the best practice that we added here. We consolidated into one section. So there's not industrial district, there's not residential, commercial, industrial. They're not separate sections. It's now all one section in one place. As you look through it, you'll see that the beginning of each district has got a one-page summary, which includes a purpose statement, which we added several of because not all the districts had purpose statements. Purpose statements, again, very important. If somebody comes to you looking to amend something, looking to add something, looking to change something, it's there for the public and primarily for you and the village board to look at it and go, what did we mean to do with the R3 district? Oh, right, this is the one that does this, right? And that becomes a very useful tool. So we added that. So these pages have the purpose statement. They've got references on where to look for all the other things you need to know, like parking and landscape and stuff like that. And they've got a little table of the bulk standards, and it's got a little graphic kind of like this, just because people see these things differently. And the idea of making it more user-friendly is to have these different versions of this. So we added that. The R3 and the R4 had an interesting intent about allowing different forms of townhomes and multiple family housing. But it was difficult to use. It did not clarify where and when and what the bulk standards were going to be for different types. So we specified that. So now when you look at those two districts, you'll see clarity in terms of what can be built, and that may encourage people to use it. We hope it does. The ORI kind of had 3 different districts based on the way that development happened. We consolidated that. We kind of created the least common denominator so that we would not intentionally create any nonconformities there. So that, again, is just a little bit easier to use. One of the other things that comes up in a lot of the communities that we work in now are ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And so this is the opportunity to add a unit to the back of your house or over your garage, or convert a garage into a dwelling unit, and to do it either by right or by some sort of permit. It was something we talked about with the steering committee, and they said, and we agree, it's a much deeper issue than the sort of thing we would bring to you tonight and just say, hey, what do you think? It's something that requires some community input and something that the village can take on at a later date. So that's not in here now. There's no recommendation.
That would have been a landmine.
So there's a lot in there. If you've had a chance to look through it, you've probably seen it, but any questions about use or the use districts? Okay, so let's go to the next district, and David can talk about it.
So this is the mechanics of your zoning code and how it's administered and enforced, as the title suggests. One of the big things that was done, and this is to streamline the development, review, and approval process of the village, is consolidating the ZBA with the Planning and Zoning Commission. So it'll be one entity. There was a lot of support for that. And again, it's kind of become more of a standard with communities throughout the region to separate these two. Traditionally, they had always been, to consolidate both of them. Traditionally, they had been separated. But enabling someone to have to only go to one body to have a review of their permit is a lot easier than having to first go to ZBA or Planning Commission, whatever the case may be. So we did that. We also created a process for administrative variations with standards. These will be variations up to 5% of the bulk standards that can be approved by staff based on standards that we built into the code itself. This way, this body would be getting more substantive variation requests beyond those 5% quantifiable measured standards. Notice used to be a very as Michael had alluded to earlier, notice used to be a little bit convoluted in the zoning ordinance. We streamlined it, we clarified it. We got rid of the registered mail provision. It's now first class mail by the applicant. It used to be that staff used to take care of these, which could create due process issues for the village, and we want to protect the village from that. So it's now going to be on the applicant to show that they've complied with the mailed notice requirements, and there'll be an affidavit that they'll present to you to staff to ensure that they've followed those rules. We also added a signposting requirement. We find that that's the best way to inform the public of a matter, of a zoning matter that's going to be affecting a piece of property. And then there's newspaper notice requirements, but those are statutory. It's just cleaned up the language. You had in the original zoning code, there were these secondary special use permit findings. So you would first work through a series of primary findings, and then there was a set of secondary findings. And that was an unusual structure. We had never seen that before. And we made a strong push to remove the secondary findings because we also didn't think that they necessarily added a lot. And one of the things that Michael said when he was explaining some of the earlier sections is we want to make sure that whatever we're doing actually adds value to the process, not just adds process for the sake of process. So we got rid of those secondary special use findings. We increased the planned development threshold from 1 acre to 3 acres. We just think with the development trends in the village, Oh, yes, right. Right, okay,
Three,
right,
two, one.
yeah,
Sorry,
you're,
back.
yeah, that's right, sorry. You're, you're pretty much a built-out community in many respects with limited opportunities to annex, huge acres of land. So in order to promote redevelopment activity over time, we lowered the threshold of planned developments from 3 acres to 1 acre. Sorry about that. So we also added provisions for minor amendments, and also requirements that between concept, development plan and final development plan, that has to happen within 1 year. And then we added a provision for certificate of zoning compliance. This will obviate, sometimes staff gets requests from property owners for a zoning determination letter. We really frown on those. We don't think staff should be put in the position of that, but as someone goes through a zoning process to get a special use permit or a variation, whatever the case may be, there is a certificate of zoning compliance that then can trigger a certificate of occupancy. So that has been added. That is an administrative step that has been added, but we see a lot of value in that. And it keeps your property records very current for all the properties in the village. Any questions?
A question about the administrative variations. How common are those in similar communities?
They're becoming, they're common and they're becoming more common because there's an acknowledgement that, if someone has to come to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a 1-foot side yard variation, that's like a lot of time and expense that they have to put into something that, staff based on reasonable objective standards can just approve. And that's what we've done with those objectives. Oh, yeah. There is still a notice. I should say that. Yeah, that's important. There is still a notice process. So neighbors are going to be aware that this is happening. If there are objections, it could conceivably trigger a public hearing. That's provided for in there. But by and large, these would be the types of variations that your agenda should be dealing with substantive issues that do have a potentially dramatic effect on surrounding property owners. We're thinking of just very minor things here.
The way it's worded and the way you explained it, would that have the potential to cause 2 sets of back and forth though, if the property owner requests it through the staff and the staff have the determination, the neighbors have the way in, that's denied, and then that goes to, the full council, like that just delays it more than if they just went to the full council to begin with?
Again, it could. There is an appeal process. The appeal would certainly come back to the zoning board. So if there's an adverse decision, the property owner would have a right to bring an appeal to here, to the full body, to here. If the neighbors objected, they can certainly bring that issue to the board, as the board has appellate jurisdiction over all administrative matters in the village. So that could be something that could happen. But the reason why we build in a notice process into the administrative variation thing is so that staff can say, oh, you know what, this is going to create a lot of problems in this part of this neighborhood. And we have to go through a full public hearing process. The hope is that these are of such a minor quality that it's not going to trigger that type of interplay with the public.
Yeah, I see that as what I described as like a worst case, but then on the other end of the spectrum, it will have a tendency of turning a 30-foot setback into a 28.5 setback just because it's going to get rubber stamped. So then just make the setback 28.5 feet to begin with.
I would hesitate to say it's rubber stamp because again, we did build in clearly objective factors and there is still the notice provision. So if a neighbor does have a problem with that 2.5-foot reduction, then or 1.5-foot reduction, whatever it is. I'm a lawyer, not a man.
I'm being a little bit pedantic, but I hope you
No, I get
understand what I'm getting at.
No, we talked about the standards a lot when we are going over this. And essentially I have to feel comfortable putting myself on the line as the person, as the zoning administrator granting any sort of administrative variance. So we discussed as part of like creating the standards and everything is giving me the ability to just not grant a variance and just having it request a variance from the plan commission right away, depending on, you know, my level of comfort, my knowledge of the property history, neighbors, things like that. And obviously I won't be here forever. But it'll be built, I know, it'll be built into the code so that future zoning
Karen
administrators
has to
have
study.
something to go back on.
Would that be overly burdensome from you versus just punting it to us?
I don't think so, because I don't think it's gonna come up a lot. I think it'll be good for small projects, like someone whose driveway is like 6 inches too close to the property line,
Mhm.
things like that. And I think it'll be good for the things where it does cause multiple public hearings of the same type of thing from the zoning board of appeals, where you've been how many ZBA meetings where you're like, why are we even here? Like, we're just like, this is ridiculous.
Verbatim,
Because you approved it the
That was-
last 20 times that it came before
Yeah.
you, and then this.
And it's such a small, I know for sure you've said this is such a small request. So it would take care of things like that.
I think changing it to the lower, like you had said, because again, in many cases, it's very isolated in one house, and if it changed, it makes no difference in the entire block or the subdivision. But if it was changed to the 28.5 and you compound and accumulate that through a block and somebody's redeveloping, got some older neighborhoods, right? Somebody goes in and knocks down 6 houses and wants to redo. Now they do all of those at only 28.5. Now you got a little bit different of a situation.
Yeah.
That's my view on it.
Yeah, you're touching on a lot of the spirit of it. It's one of the things we talked about was making this a more user-friendly document for
Right.
everyone. The users on the property owner's side, and then certainly the users on staff side. So this is just among those user-friendly additions that we have been doing with a lot of codes. And based upon conversations with staff, based upon some of the stakeholder interviews we had, we saw that there could be real value to add this type of process with, again, delegated authority and objective factors, as well as due process for neighboring property owners.
Just wanted to add a couple things. One is to echo what Karen said is the example I was going to use for those of you that have been part of ZBA and these cases come before you, you're like, why are we even seeing this? Right? We've all had, that's really what this is meant to deal with. And it's ultimately a benefit to the residents. Their neighbors will still be involved. And that's really the intent here, is that this is residents' village doing something to help them out. Right? And you know, you all feel that more than most people, because residents stand before you and ask for things, right? And so that's really what this sort of thing is for. Along those lines too, the other thing I'd like to add to what David said about this is there's a real economic development aspect to having this kind of clarified and more effective process that David described and that he put together, because both of our firms have got developer clients. We have private sector clients. And developer clients or developers will look for a community that's got a better organization, a better structure, a predictable process. And I go so far as to ask the ones that we deal with, I'm like, hey, all things being equal, 2 towns, locations similar, they will always go to the town that's got a more understandable process, one that they know what to expect. Not that they're guaranteed of approval, but that there's not going to be any surprises. And that no surprises thing, that also goes for the residents, it goes for the village board, and it goes for you. So there's a lot of benefit to this. And some of the graphics that are in there, that variance procedure thing, every one of these sections has got a little simple oversimplification of the process, so people kind of wrap their heads around it. Tastefully done in Roselle Red, I might point out. And so this section is absolutely one of the most important, because it's got all of these trickle down benefits to the community when it's improved. I'll step down off my soapbox.
Okay.
See if there's any more questions. Okay, great. Let's go to the next section. Off-street parking. The off-street parking section was kind of basic. And so we added a lot of things that are useful and more modern. We continue to have kind of a standard zoning approach. If you read planning literature, you read a lot about different approaches to zoning. In essentially suburban communities, those approaches don't always work. But what we did was we changed the zoning standards to be things that are more in keeping with industry standards. Some of them were kind of high and demanded a lot more parking. The other thing that we built in here is some ways for there to not have to be as much parking. So there's opportunities, I'm reading out of order here, but there's opportunities here for cross-access agreements for land banking parking, for sharing parking. Land banking parking is most useful in industrial districts typically. So if a use comes in and based on square footage, it might have to have 100 parking spaces, but it's a data center. It's something that only has 25 employees. They can leave some of that. They have to designate the parking area, but they don't have to build it until such time as, frankly, the village says there's an issue or a future owner comes in and needs the parking. So the idea really is to modernize those sorts of things, which create flexibility that when staff is working with somebody, that it's not entirely all or nothing. So a couple other of those things, this idea of a reuse rule. So restaurants typically have got a higher parking demand than, say, a little retail shop. One of the things that is important in business districts, especially in town center or downtown districts, is this idea that you maintain and you keep vibrancy, right? And there is not a place for somebody to just add parking if they've got a business here in the town center. So the business that goes in and reuses a space doesn't have to provide more parking if required by code. And this is another tried and true economic development tool. This both acknowledges and is part of the question of, do we have enough parking in the downtown? And that's a whole other discussion about a parking problem being a good thing, and when so that those discussions get held otherwise. The other part about this is that where there is non-conforming, other than the B3, if a building is damaged by more than 50% and it gets rebuilt, it has to then meet the parking requirement. There can be opportunities for relief or other approaches, but it would have to ultimately meet the parking requirement. We've clarified what you can do with a parking pad in a residential district, essentially to keep you from kind of paving the whole front of your driveway across the front of your house. And there's a width limitation on it now. Some of the other clarifications are in there. The other thing I want to point out was the administrative approval for some of these as well. So like I said, the parking section, the loading section was painfully detailed in terms of breaking it down by type of use and who and how many. We've greatly simplified that again, so that it can be more user-friendly and just as effective. Anything else on parking? This was a section where we added, I think, as much or more than some of the other sections, because it was kind of deficient in terms of what we're seeing in modern and effective codes. Landscaping and tree preservation. This again was a lot of clarifying and making a little more efficient, if you will. We updated some of the standards for screening, parking lot, transitional landscaping, which got mentioned before, and ultimately the review process. There was a lot of review process related to just landscaping. And it's not, as David said, it doesn't really add value to the process. And our strong belief is that good landscaping can be directed by the code and approved as part of a plan review process. So we streamlined that a little bit. So again, this idea of landscape review by the village board would only be part of a special use or an SUP, something that they were going to see anyway, but not to add to their agenda with those things, that those would be administratively approved. As David said, there are more substantive things to be dealt with than a landscape plan, and we feel strongly about that. We added specific interior landscaping requirements. Commercial landscaping in particular has got really a couple of major factors. One is the perimeter, right? There's something around the edge. And two is what's inside, so that when you drive in, you don't just see the sea of parking. We were a little light on the sea of parking prevention. And so we added some things there. the picture here of the bioswale along the curb is lovely. This is done with native plantings. These are called best management practices. They're a way to deal with stormwater. They are not always something that everybody likes to use. They are in there as a suggestion. They are not in there as a requirement. They are in there as something that's sort of held up as, hey, you may want to try this. It would have to be approved as part of an engineering review of stormwater management systems, and it would have to be maintained. But they are sometimes controversial in terms of their effectiveness long-term. And not everybody likes the look. So we see most communities not wanting to require it, but we sort of had a note in there to bring it to people's attention if they're of a mind.
Question on the interior with regard to parking lots. This was an area where it seemed like you guys were a little stricter than before. Does the net result of this cause a parking lot under the old zoning to have more spaces than the new zoning or less spaces?
Great question. So first of all, nobody's got to go back and add landscaping. Somebody's got to, well, and people don't always know. So I just wanted to get it out there, right? So you don't have to go back and fix it. What you do essentially do is you give up the potential for a couple of parking spaces by having that interior parking and with the tree in it and that sort of thing. That becomes part of the design question, right? And so as somebody is laying out a parking lot, they have to be cognizant of that. Ultimately, it doesn't cost anybody a lot of parking spaces, but sometimes it comes down to a few, right? So yeah, ultimately this may cost a parking space or two, but given that applicants will know this in advance, generally we don't see people have a problem with it. If there is an absolute problem where a requirement creates a hardship, then some sort of relief is possible. Great. Let's go to section 7, which is nonconformities. Your favorite, David.
So non-conforming regulations, and the villages were certainly no exception, are some of the hardest regulations to get right because you use a lot of language that can be confusing to just an average user of a code. Someone who's not a zoning specialist can just get lost in the wording. So we're very cognizant of that. So the first thing we always look at is how is it structured? And then how can it be better structured so that people can make a distinction between a non-conforming use, a non-conforming building, what non-conforming lot, and clearly lay out and delineate the regulations for each type of potential non-conformity that could occur. So there was a significant reorganization and expansion of this section because we also thought that certain things were missing that could make it clearer. So those provisions were added. And another thing we were presenting, but ultimately it was decided to be considered at a future date, is amortization of non-conforming uses. It is amortization is just what it sounds like. You amortize the use out over a period of years based on its economic value. And after that point, it needs to come into conformity with the district it's in. That was presented. It was better thought at this point in time that the village will wait on that and maybe consider it later on. Any questions on those?
Add that I'd like this diagram here and the accompanying calculations, it was clear.
Yeah, the nonconformities don't come up all that often necessarily, but when they do, it's important that the standards be understandable. Okay, let's go to the next section. Performance standards. I will tell you only half jokingly that if you've looked at the performance standards in your code, you're probably looking at the performance standards that are in 95% of the other codes in the state of Illinois. I honestly believe somebody wrote one of these in 1965 and people have been copying it ever since. And I say this as a former, right? I say this as a former community development director who never had a Ringelmann chart or couldn't figure out how to get the light meter to work. The the standards that are just so, this is another situation where they're so specific, they're unenforceable. And you really can't help residents that have got a problem with an adjacent property because they're so specific. What we did was two things here. One is we fall back in no small part on the nuisance standards, which are a different part of your code. So if somebody is creating an issue with a nuisance, there's certainly an opportunity for enforcement. The other thing we did was we trued these up with state and federal regulations so that as a business operator, you only have to worry about one set of standards. You have to be clear that you're meeting them. And it also gives the residents a sense of certainty that there is a fixed standard of a threshold of what can happen in terms of noise, pollution, sewage, hazardous materials, explosive materials. It's a fun section. But again, the idea was to true it up with broader standards. And this is probably something as a commission you will never use, but it's something that comes into play with staff and code. Okay, the next section are design standards. So this is something new. This was an idea that came out of the village's comprehensive plan. Was very much focused on this area that you see outlined here, which is the town center plus a bit. And the idea that how things look is important as well. So the code includes two sets of design standards, one for this area, which are drawn rather directly from the comprehensive plan because they were very good. Hats off to the folks at Ginkgo. It was a very thoughtful set of standards, and that's in there now. There are further design standards for other business and industrial district. We started with the approach. We started talking about the approach at the get-go when we did the first open house because this question of design standards was here from the beginning. And what we talked about was how to do this. There are any number of ways that you can deal with design review. You can overdo it. It's very easy to overdo, or you can ignore it, right? And somewhere in between is the right answer. And in talking with, as Karen mentioned, we went through stakeholder meetings, we went through discussions with staff, we talked about this with the steering committee. And one that we find works well with our client communities is this idea that these are a set of standards. And if you take a look at them, they're not black and white. It's not the building shall be made out of brick or the building shall. They are design objectives. They are things that the village is essentially inviting a designer and a property owner to think about as they do the design, and for you all and the village board and staff to think about as they review it. And there are different ways that these things can be, that these standards can be met. One of the things that people are always concerned about when you have design standards is, well, now everything's going to look the same, right? And that's just not the way it's written. And it's not the way it's used. It's a way of thinking about how you're approaching it. And it's a way for you as you sit up here to say, you know, the building talks about being respectful to the buildings around it. And this one looks completely different and it's bizarre. Can you explain to us how you feel you've met this standard, right? Rather than saying, I don't like this, right? Which is just the opposite of what any process should be, right? So this gives standards for the village as a reviewer and the designer as the architect as a designer to meet. So that's the what. The how is also a choice. In some communities, there is a design review commission or an architectural review board. They all have different names. And it's another level of meeting that an applicant has to go to. And again, as we talk to people throughout from the very beginning, from the open house, the idea was yes to design review, no to extra process. And so what the code spells out, what you see described here, is that if there is ground up construction, something that's a special use or some other zoning entitlement that somebody's going to go through the process for anyway, these standards would be applied by you as a commission and the village board. If somebody is looking to do an exterior change, like put new light fixtures out or an awning or something that's a single structural element, then these would be administratively enforced. And again, from our experience in the communities we work with that do this, we think this is the right choice that you've made in terms of how to apply it. All right. Next slide. David already talked a little bit about signs, but.
So this is going to come back to you, and it will be an amendment to the code that once it's created. So, but again, it's going to reorient the regulations toward content neutrality, which is something the Supreme Court tells us we have to do now. So anything, we're going to remove any requirement that staff needs to read the sign to understand how it needs to be regulated. We'll reorganize it. Again, there'll be a lot of graphics in it because that's probably the easiest way to establish these types of standards. Here's what your sign should look like in this district for this purpose. And then again, right now your sign code stands alone within the village code. It will now become part of the zoning code, which means that if you're going to amend it in the future, it would have to go through the text amendment process. And then one of the things we discussed with staff was this concept, instead of specifically tying signs to individual zoning districts, we have these broader sign districts that could encapsulate a number of zoning districts. And that's a more streamlined and effective way to do these. So those will be coming to you. They're not quite ready yet.
A sneak peek, as they say.
Yeah, so some of the graphics up there will be incorporated. You'll see it in the sign code that we present to you to kind of give that the visual aspects of what a sign.
That's all. It only took us an hour.
Okay.
Again, I would reiterate by saying, you know, we very much look to modernize and make more user-friendly, and user-friendly applies both to residents and property owners and staff and you all and the village board. We tried to prioritize a little bit. So you saw some things that kind of moved more towards administrative review with standards as opposed to being on your agenda or on the village board's agenda. Because that higher level of review, again, it's really not necessarily adding value to the process, and you all have more substantive things to deal with than that. And then there was just the idea of modernizing, finding the best practices, adding the graphics, adding tables, adding charts, making it just easier to read those one-page summaries that we talked about. And so we tried not to put any landmines in there, but we tried to make it a more user-friendly and usable document. So with that, we're more than happy to answer any other questions that you have.
Well, thanks. I think it's a job well done, and I'm certainly looking forward to using these new sets moving forward. So great. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions from any of the commissioners? Okay, did we get any public comments in by any chance?
No, but if we want to open it up.
Okay. Do we want to open up any commentary or questions from the audience? You are the only one. Please, to the podium.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to swear you in as well.
Name is Anthony Bonavolanta. I live at 845 Butternut Court, Roselle, Illinois. I've been a resident here since 1965.
And can I swear you in as well? Can you raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
I'm a freak. I read the entire ordinance, and I have a whole bunch of ordinances in my office at home.
Okay.
And I think they did an excellent job in presentation. The
I think so,
graphics is unbelievable. When you look at other villages and other codes, they are difficult to read. I think you've streamlined a lot of it. I still have some questions on some of the areas, like, and I represent them, so I've got a hard position to be in right now. What about people that have parking that's sitting on their property? They meet the ordinance, but the cars are sitting there forever. Has anybody ever addressed that to anybody? That's number one.
Okay.
Second, what about if there are existing buildings, and you just brought up, and where a garage says only 800 square feet, but the guy has 3 acres of land or 2 acres of land, and he wants to build just like the next door neighbor. What does he do? Does he ask for a variance? Does he ask to come before the board?
Well, I think the process basically states he does, right?
And I know Karen and I've talked about this a lot.
It's got 5%, but that's about it.
Yeah,
Is there a third?
when?
Is there a third question?
No, I think that, well,
Oh.
I had a whole bunch of them, but I think I'm gonna give up on all the rest. Aesthetics, have you approached aesthetics in the code?
It's the
We
design.
have a lot of houses here in town.
Gotta leave something for us to do. so
Really
probably
don't
leave
care
that meetings.
about maintenance and taking care of their they look beautiful when the plants all went in, but that died 15 years ago. And now it's dead, just a dead area. What do we do about that? We used to have a group here called Pride in Roselle. And they would go around and talk to the people. But some people maybe can't afford to do any landscaping or upgrade their houses. What do you do about it?
So I think,
You can't be, the village can't go in there and tell a guy, you gotta do something. I think that would be,
Yeah, so then those are good concerns, good questions. Probably
those are
beyond
the
the
things
scope
I
of
want
this
you all to
meeting.
think
Yeah,
about.
but definitely worth thinking about, and we have the mayor and some trustees here too, so I'm sure it's in their minds as well to try to address.
That's all I got, because I love our town, okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
there's one.
Oh, please. Can you come to the podium, please? I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I apologize. No.
It's okay.
Please, there's no such thing as a stupid question, so don't worry about
Price is light. You gotta tell her to come on down.
it.
Roselle, my name is Cheryl Danner. I've been born and raised here, basically. Been a Roselle, Bloomingdale girl for quite a while. Moved away, came back because I love this.
Can I
my
swear you in, please? Yeah, there you go. So I've got your name and address, so do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you so much.
Question I have for you that I noticed in Arizona. Height restrictions, really important. It looks really bad when everything starts going choo, 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 choo. And signs. They used to have a thing where you could not have signs. They had to be on the ground. They couldn't be on top of huge buildings. Do we have these ordinances?
Yeah.
Okay, for both those things?
Mhm.
Okay. Additional questions, concerns from the audience? No? Okay. All right, so let's close the public hearing. Can I get a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Oh, actually, we're doing a roll call here.
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
gonna give it to Terry as the second. Jason Wertz,
Yes.
Terry Wallach,
Yes.
Brian Booz,
Aye.
Joe Lewis, Chairman Patel.
Yes. Oh. Any other further discussion?
None by me. I mean. Seems to achieve a lot of the goals over the past number of years.
Yeah, I'm looking,
That pulling it together and I had a little bit of insight being on some of the committees.
Okay.
Reviewing some of it, but even being on this board, I don't necessarily enjoy reviewing zoning ordinances, but anything you can do to find the answer more quickly and more efficiently, I think is better for the residents, the developers, the future development, everything. So it's just, I think the confidence here is rewrite the zoning ordinance makes it sound like something was done drastically. It should be called reorganize the zoning ordinance more so
Right.
than rewrite.
I,
It was, they rewrote the template using mostly the same rules and regulations. And when just my insight of being on the committee, it was really great to ask these guys questions as to what is Glen Ellen doing? What is Lombard doing? What is Glenview doing? What are these other communities that that are either like us or advanced in us in terms of their redevelopment, continued development? What did they do or what problems did they have if they did do this? And So that was, it was really insightful and just gave you confidence to kind of move forward with different pieces of this.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, I think what I'm looking forward to is consistency. So, we have many things that get presented to us and it depends on members here and a lot of it's very subjective. And I think we move away from consistent Roselle, if you will, right? So I'm hoping that these new amendments and these new changes help that when we have to make decisions up here. Okay, anything else? Okay, can I get a motion to approve the findings of fact for PC 22-1105?
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Were you the first, Brian?
Aye.
Brian Booth.
Aye.
Jason Wertz.
Yes.
Joseph Lewis.
Aye.
Terry Wallach.
Aye.
Chairman Patel.
Can I get a motion to recommend the approval of the amendment to the village board for PZ 22-1105?
I'll make that motion.
Jason Wertz.
Yes.
Brian Booth. Terry Wallach.
Aye.
Joseph Lewis.
Aye.
Chairman Patel.
Yes. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Old business? New business? Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All right, motion, meeting adjourned.